Our coverage of a West Fargo murder trial. Spencer Moen now officially plans to appeal his conviction.
Valley News Team's Bobby Fallett joins us live in studio with the latest. Bobby.
Yeah, Stacey, Justin, just over 2 months ago, Spencer Moen of West Fargo was sentenced to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was convicted of the murder of his wife Sonia in August of 2023. But Spencer Moen has now sent the North Dakota Supreme Court a notice of appeal. Now, North Dakota's Century Code gives defendants the right to appeal their convictions. The notice of appeal to the Supreme Court states the issues being brought up by Moen is that there was insufficient evidence to sustain conviction and the state failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, state prosecutors told me today that Moen's conviction was based upon the overwhelming evidence established by the West Fargo Police Department's thorough investigation, and that the jury rightly convicted him based on the totality of the evidence, and the judge sentenced him as justice required. Now, the assistant state's attorney who is handling the appeal process declined to speculate when arguments will be heard by the Supreme Court. After a transcript is filed, Moen has 40 days to file a brief, basically file his argument. After that is filed, the state has 30 days to file its brief. Moen then has the option to file a reply brief within 14 days after the state's oral argument, or after the state does that, then oral arguments will then be scheduled. Now, we also reached out to the public defender in Moen's case. We have not heard back from him at this time. Justin, Stacey.